Hello, everyone. I'm Karen MacNeil, author of The Wine Bible, and this is WineSpeed.com's People to Know, insider interviews with the most important and fascinating people in the wine business. And today we have the great pleasure of interviewing Stephen Spurrier. Stephen is a legendary figure in the international world of wine, an author, an educator, a consultant, a wine merchant, and most recently, a vintner whose sparkling wine, Rides Valley, helped establish the early and exciting sparkling wine industry in Southern England. Stephen Spurrier is perhaps best known for having created the controversial tasting between top California wines and French wines in 1976, subsequently referred to as the Judgment of Paris. A graduate of the London School of Economics, Stephen is the author of 8 books, of which 2, L'Académie du Vin Wine Course and the L'Académie du Vin Guide to French Wines, have been translated into several languages. In 1993, he joined the team at Decanter magazine and has written more than 300 columns. And of course, over the course of his career, he has received numerous awards, including the Ritz-Carlton Millennial Lifetime Achievement Award, the Le Grand Prix de l'Académie Internationale du Vin Award, and also the Andrei Chelychev Maestro Award. In 2017, he was named Decanter Magazine's Man of the Year. Stephen, welcome. It is great to see you.
Karen, very much. Thank you very much. It's great to be with you.
Absolutely. And you know, your life, I know, has been and is filled with so much great wine, but I'd like you to share with us the first wine you ever tasted. As I recall, it was something your grandfather gave you.
Well, it is a Damascene conversion at the age of 13, I think. I was at the family house in Derbyshire, probably my first Christmas Eve in long trousers. And the dinner, Christmas Eve, was drawing to an end. And my grandfather turned to me and said, "I think you're old enough for a glass of port." So he asked the butler to bring me a glass. And the decanter was passed towards me, to the left, of course. And I poured myself a glass and I took a sip. And I said, "My gosh, Grandpa, what's this?" Coburn's 08, my boy. And that, honestly, I was so stunned by it. And that I was really stunned by it. And also, at the time, I collected stamps. A lot of my contemporaries did. And so Coburn's 08, it corresponded to a stamp collection in the fact that it had a country, it had a date, it had a label. And of course, I never collected wine at the age of 13 or 14. But in my history and geography lessons, when I went to the public school at Rugby, I did kind of read a bit about wine. And one of the first essays I ever wrote was on French wine. So I think it was preordained, but it was the Damascene conversion.
Yeah, I just can't love to have a glass of 1908 port myself right now.
Well, I can tell you when the Symington family bought Coburn's about 10 years ago now, maybe more, they gave a tasting at the factory house in Oporto, and they went right back until I think 1885 or something like that. And every vintage they'd ever made, they started with 1977, and each one of the Symington family commented on the vintage. And when they came to 1908, Paul Symington said, "Does anyone else have any comments on that?" And I told them the story. And it was the best wine of the day. And it still is. I went to another tasting they did, and I arrived late, and I heard Paul saying, "And this is the wine that sends Stephen Spurrier into the wine trade."
Now, speaking of being sent into the wine trade, what was your first job in the wine industry?
My first job was a trainee with Christopher and Company, who were the oldest, well, they billed themselves with some justification as the oldest wine merchant in London, because they said their records had been destroyed by the fire of London in 1666. And Berry Brothers and Rudd only date from 1692 or something. So, but it was a great traineeship. And I was in the cellars the whole time, bottling. We bottled port. We even bottled Cheval Blanc 62. And the London bottling of clarets in those days was really good, full long corks. And then what was even better still, that was 64, by the way, spring, February, March 64. And then I went to Champagne and Burgundy very briefly to see the suppliers in September, October 64 for the vintage, an early vintage, very hot year. But then from February until October 1965, I spent the entire time in Europe visiting their suppliers. And that was just amazing. I mean, going to Bordeaux and Burgundy 55 years ago was quite different than going to it now. It was an eye-opener.
I can only imagine. It's stunning how much the wine business has changed. Even the idea that that London merchants were purchasing wine in barrel and bottling it themselves for their prestigious clientele is astounding. When
well,
we look back, please
we were the important market. I don't say the importantest market. I know that Holland was very strong, but they didn't pay the top prices. It was, of course, I met, and if I travel abroad now and go to Bordeaux, I meet the grandchildren. You know, so I mean, Louis Latour in Burgundy, as you know, they're always called Louis Latour. But I'm now meeting Louis Latour, the whomever, the grandchild.
Yes. Now, you have been an inspiration and a teacher and a mentor to many, but I wonder if you yourself had a mentor in those early days.
Well, without him knowing it, I had Michael Broadbent. Well, I said it in the book that l'Académie du Vin Library, my venture. I founded a couple of years ago with Hugh Johnson to bring proper wine books back. Yours is the Wine Bible, of course. Karen is the best wine book on the planet. But I said a hero and a mentor. So my hero was Alexis Lichy, because I really loved his books, and he was I got to know him very well in my Paris days, but he was a great character. So he was already my hero, but Michael Broadbent was my mentor, because Michael Broadbent taught me how to taste through his book. And I used to go to the Christmas tastings and see Michael, very kind of handsome man, as you know, but slightly professorial, going down the lines, looking at the color, sniffing, tasting, nosing, spitting out. And then, of course, I read his book, Wine Tasting, which is where it all began. There would have been no Académie du Vin without wine tasting.
Yes.
Impossible to think I could have created a wine school without that book.
Well, I do want to go to that, because here you were, you know, with London's oldest wine merchant, and then in quite a bold move, you moved to Paris. I mean, it was like the script of a film or something. Dashing young Englishman moves to Paris.
There was an interim of a couple of years in Provence, and I mean, I have to admit that I have a privileged upbringing, and I inherited, well, the family company was sold in 64 or 65, and I had quite a lot of cash. And so, as one does at the age of about 24, you buy a property in Provence. And I bought a really lovely 30-hectare property with a ruin on it, with the intention to rebuild the ruin. And actually then go into the antiques business, because my other passion was art, and still is. And anyway, the chapter in my book is called Var from the Madding Crowd, and it was in the Var department in France. And so Bella and I got married on the 31st of January 1968. We just celebrated our 53rd wedding anniversary, and we boarded the Golden Arrow at Victoria Station and moved to France, lock, stock, and barrel. So we lived in Provence for 2.5 years, and it didn't work out for various reasons, as one would imagine when one's young and rich. People take money from you. And so I said, Bella said, well, should we go back to London? This hasn't worked out. I said, no. We'll go to Paris and I'll go back in the wine trade. That's the other thing I know. And so we went to Paris, but there was no wine trade. And walking up a little street with a great friend of mine, we passed a wine shop, just a single window wine shop. And I said, Christopher, that's the shop I dream about. I could turn that around in 10 minutes and it will be perfect. So he dragged me in, and I looked at the wines on the shelves, which weren't terribly impressive. They weren't bad. And Madame behind the counter, a sophisticated lady in probably middle age, said, may I sell you something? And Christopher said, yes, my friend would like to buy your shop. So that's how it began. But what was interesting is that was October 1970. Her husband, who died 2 previous years ago of cancer, had been a very good caviste, as they were called. And she didn't think that this young Englishman, whose French wasn't very good, could possibly carry on the mantle of her husband. So I said, okay, Madame Fouchard, that was her name, here's the deal. I'll work for you for free for 6 months. And then if you think I'm able to carry on your husband's legacy, we'll sign the deal. So on April 1st, 1971, she gave me the keys to the cash desk, which is of course what you do. And I put an ad in the Herald Tribune which said, your wine merchant speaks English, called Stephen Spurrier. And that was where it all began.
Your wine merchant speaks English was brilliant because there were a lot of expat Americans.
There were many more. The banks, there was every single bank, every single American bank with most of the law firms. And they were all, the shop was just off the Madeleine. There's a little side street between the Rue Royale and Rue Boissy-Anglas. And they were all in what was called the Golden Triangle, in which the Madeleine was the middle of the Golden Triangle.
Fantastic.
Could not have been a place.
What is it today? Is it still a wine shop?
No. The whole of the little street has been completely smartened up. I mean, when I sold it, it remained a wine shop for a couple of years, but not anymore.
Not anymore. Stephen, I'm curious about how after a long, almost 60-year career, you're probably best known in the US anyway for your role in what would eventually come to be known as the Judgment of Paris. How do you feel about that? Because it's really only one part of so many of the things that you've accomplished.
Well, I mean, I feel, as I've said often, the thing I'm most proud of is the creation of l'Académie du Vin and all that spun off from there. So it was l'Académie du Vin, and thanks actually on the inspiration from my partner, Patricia Gallagher, who was American and went over with the early settlers to the East Coast, her family. She was appalled that there were no American wines, no good American wines available in Paris. And because at l'Académie du Vin, we really were the only game in town for people who did not speak French, and we had a big tasting room. So some California vintners and journalists like Bob Finnegan and Alexis Bespalov came over bringing wines, and Patricia particularly was very impressed by it. I'd never tasted California wine before. Anyway, the Judgment of Paris, as it has been called, was in celebration of the bicentennial of the War of Independence, 1776. So it was really hands across the sea. And it was just, we got together the wines. Patricia went to California in September. I followed to make the final selection in April. And it was really hands across the sea, and it wasn't supposed to be a competition at all.
No.
But wait, and we had probably 9 of the best palates in France, Herbert de Verlaine from the Romani-Conti, people like that. And it occurred to me once the wines had arrived in Paris, and that's another story, that with the exception of Herbert de Verlaine, who was married to Pamela from San Francisco, and possibly Christian Vaniquet, who was the youngest head sommelier at La Tour d'Argent, none of the other 9 would have ever tasted California wine before. And my worry was, good though they were, they would be damned with faint praise. You know, c'est pas mal, c'est surprenant. And that was not what we wanted. What we wanted was recognition. It was entirely altruistic. We didn't want to put California on the map the way we did, but we wanted recognition. And so I decided, against Patricia's wishes, she said they'd not come to the blind tasting, to put the 4 best white Burgundies from my shop in, and the 4 best clarets, Cabernet Sauvignon based. And when the judges appeared at the Intercontinental at 6 o'clock on May the 24th, 1976, I said, you have come expecting just to taste California wines, but I have suggested that we do the comparison, and blind, of course, random order. Do you agree? If they hadn't agreed, it wouldn't have happened. But they did agree. And George Tabor from Time magazine, who'd been doing a wine course at La Cate Divin, he turned up. He had a slow day in the office. And my wife turned up between odds and ends and picking the kids up from school to take some photographs to prove that it actually happened. And the result was what it was. But it's interesting to state that in the whites, and we served the whites first, 6 judges put Montelena top, and 3 judges put Chalon top. Chalon was my bet. Ridge was my bet in the reds, and that proved to be correct eventually. But I mean, it means that the California Chardonnays were damn good. And it also means that, I think, as I think was proved, that in the 70s, the French were resting on their laurels.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't. They were it was the first chink in French armor, and Herbert de Verlaine expressed it in much more Gallic terms as a much needed kick in the pants for French wine.
Yeah. I want to talk about Académie du Vin for a minute, because it was, of course, the first independent school in Paris to offer sort of formal wine education. And then, of course, you went on and created the Christie's wine course in the early 80s. I'm wondering if you, and these were serious wine courses that people went to as a package over many weeks. I'm wondering if you feel that today, the sort of plethora of bloggers and so-called wine influencers should know maybe more about wine academically if they intend to write about it.
That's a difficult question to answer. I think the whole basis of wine is communication. And if I had been asked to, my first name for l'Académie du Vin was going to be l'Ambassade du Vin, because I didn't consider myself an educator. I considered myself a wine ambassador, which I always have been. And if I were to describe my life in wine, apart from the early days, of course, and the time as a wine merchant, yes, also the time as a wine merchant in Paris, I would describe it as a wine communicator, because that's what well, as you are, but I mean, but I think there's a lot of mess around at the moment. There's too much useless information.
Mm.
And I think that the basic information, wine is an agricultural product. I mean, it comes from the vine first, and then intelligent work in the cellar, and then this and then that. And there's too much hype, and there's too much concentration on sort of value for money rather than value for pleasure.
Mm.
And I think a lot of the bloggers, well, some bloggers, I don't read blog sites, I must admit, they kind of miss the point. They want to make their point, which is actually probably not always the point that the consumer wants to know about.
Yes, well said. Now, do you think you have a natural aptitude for tasting? I'm wondering how you, apart from watching your friend, the late, and all of our friend, the late Michael Broadbent, apart from watching him, I'm wondering how you continued to develop your palate, or did you feel that you had just a good natural aptitude for tasting?
It's something you build on. It's something you build on by paying attention. I freely admit, and I agree with Jancis Robinson and my wife, of course, that the female palate is superior to the male palate because you're less influenced and you have a much better sense of smell through your cooking or your scents or your perfumes or whatever. But it's a matter of paying attention to every single glass. Michael Broadbent took a note on every single wine he ever tasted. And if you concentrate and know what to look for, and therefore, in a way, I don't like double blind tastings because you actually don't know what you're looking at.
Yeah.
Single blind tasting, which says Chianti Classico Sangiovese 2016, but with no label, is absolutely satisfactory because you position yourself in Sangiovese 2016 Chianti Classico. The double blind tasting just a red wine, I have no clue. So it's a matter of comparison, judging if the wine comes up to what is expected of it, where it's from, what it's made with, all this kind of stuff. And I think you build up experience. I wouldn't say Michel Bertin has probably a much better palate than I do. Hugh Johnson is fairly relaxed. Jancis, of course, Jasper Morris. But it really is a matter of paying attention. And if you don't pay attention, you miss the wine. And therefore, everyone can make mistakes. But it's just a matter of continually paying attention.
Yeah. Now, you and your wife, Bella, who you have mentioned a couple of times, planted a vineyard on your Dorset farm in southern England and began making sparkling wine, Bride's Valley. You did this at the age of 70, started a whole new project in life. And anyone who knows wine knows that to begin a project, to begin a whole new brand, not to mention the viticulture of transforming what had been a farm into a vineyard, is an enormous undertaking. Did you ever say to yourself, this is crazy? Or,
well, it was only part of the farm. But I mean, as Philippine Rothschild said, making wine is easy. It's the first 150 years that are difficult. When Bella bought the farm in 87, we moved here, well, I'm speaking from Dorset, I saw there was a lot of chalk on the farm and had lovely lower slopes going down to the sea. We're only 4 miles from the English Channel. And I was still in Paris at the time at l'Académie du Vin. So I put a couple of blocks of chalk in my pocket and put them on the desk in front of Michel Bertin, who was my top prof at l'Académie du Vin at the time. And I asked Michel, I said, where do you think those are from? And Michel said, well, Champagne, of course. I said, no, they're from South Dorset. He said, in that case, you should plant a vineyard. And that was the sort of inspiration, but I did nothing about it, of course. Had I planted, I would have planted Pinot Blanc, so I love Pinot Blanc, and I would have been a complete failure. But then I was invited to the International Wine and Spirit Competition Awards in the mid-90s, and handed a glass of something sparkling and asked by the chairman what it was. And I tasted it and I said, well, champagne, of course, certainly Chardonnay, probably a Grand Cru. Why? Night Timber Blanc de Blanc, owned by a Chicagoan called Sandy Moss, 1989. And that's what kicked off English sparkling wine. And then there was Ridgeview and all that kind of stuff. And I even wrote an article in Decanter in the very, it's probably about 2007, something like that, called very positive about English wine. And then I took a dossier to an expert who showed to Jean-Claude Boisset and Jean-Charles, of course, who you know well. And they were mad about the idea, and they wanted to take at least 70 acres from the farm, 200-acre farm, and build a winery. But after a lot of analysis, there were really only 25 acres or 26 that really were proper to be planted. So they said quite simply, you would better plant those. You buy your vines from Pépinière Guillaume, who are the greatest pépiniérist in the world. You take your grapes to Ian Edwards at Spurrier Estate, who, thank God, is 25 minutes away. He was English UK winemaker of the year 2012. I would not have even dreamt of this if I'd had to build a winery, because I don't know anything about winemaking. And so off we went. And we now, well, I mean, it's been a rocky ride. The investment has exceeded what I thought. But the wine's very good, and we have natural acidity. We have wonderful, fresh, natural acidity. And we even managed in the very warm year of 2018 to make a Pinot Noir, a still Pinot Noir. And we continue to make a still Chardonnay, only about 10%. But I'm very happy with it. And we created back home here, we're lucky enough to have a nice, big, late Georgian, early Victorian house. And we have a stable block. And the stable block is now given over entirely to Bride Valley, tasting rooms and wine and art room and all that kind of stuff. So I'm very happy with the concept, and it'll go on to the next generation. My son Christian is 50 in a couple of weeks, and my daughter Kate, who's 48. They know all about it. They know it's going to be their responsibility. So it's something from nothing, and it's, you know, we'll see how it goes.
Well, it is a beautiful wine. I've been lucky enough to taste it. You know, I'm wondering, just a few more questions, Stephen. Is there a type of wine you like the least? I'm sure people all the time ask you what you like the most, but what about the least?
The least I like show-off wines. I think wines are made to express rather than to impress. Wines that are made to impress, wines that are made solely to impress, generally sold in very heavy bottles. I don't go for those because I think wine should be drunk with food. In fact, an example, my son's coming down tomorrow evening, but I was cooking pheasant, and I was thinking of Chateau Figeac. Chateau Figeac 2005 maybe, or 2001, I think I still have that. So I'm fairly classic, but I love experimenting. I mean, I love, if I were to go to one country at the moment, I go to Italy, because I think their wines are so diverse and so ultra fascinating. And if I were to, as I've said often, there's one great variety I would not like to be without in my cellar, and that's Sangiovese. So I kind of I've not moved from Cabernet Sauvignon, Medoc, Bordeaux to Tuscany, but I've been drinking Bordeaux all my life, and I'm now fascinated by Chianti Classico.
Such a beautiful wine. Wanted to ask you, I mean, some of your colleagues we've mentioned Michael Broadbent, for example, were among the very first masters of wine. Why did you decide not to pursue, excuse me, that credential?
Because I don't like doing exams. I don't like taking exams. I remember about 20 years ago, talking to Michael Smith, who's a good friend of mine, who was Australia's first master of wine. And I said, you know, Michael, I think I might try the Master of Wine exam. He said, well, you're absolutely ready for it. So the Institute said I could do it, even though I hadn't passed any WSET or things like that, but my books were standard reading. Okay. So I got them to send me a questionnaire, some of the last year's examination questions. And one of them read, you are an importer of wine in bulk, and your tanker truck arrives and the wine is volatile. What do you do? Reply in 6,000 words or something like that, 3,000 words. I would have replied in 3, send it back. I knew that wasn't quite my métier.
Oh, and Stephen, lastly, for the video part of our interview, I want to you to, if you would, share with us something about yourself that would surprise most people to know.
Gosh. Well, that's a difficult. I mean, I wouldn't say I have no surprises in my life. I'm sure I have. I'm sure I have lots. Oh well, yeah, yes, I know. Art is the second most important thing in my life, if not the most important, because I think you have a copy of the book. My memoirs have been republished under the title "A Life in Wine." And,
here it is right here, A Life in Wine.
Thank you. Okay, and 2 years after the original memoirs were published, which were a little bit self-indulgent. So it's more tightly edited, and I added a last chapter bringing it up to date. And I come to the conclusion, if I had to put what of the 2 most important things in my life are, taking out family and children, of course, that, wine or art, I would go down on art side. Because you can see, you can't see, I'm in my study, but I got the whole collection of Goya's Tauromachia on the walls. I just hung a new picture downstairs just yesterday. You can see art the whole time, and you recognize why you buy it. Sometimes you make a mistake, sometimes you don't. I go to galleries very often. Wine is part of my life. Wine is my life, a life in wine. I cannot imagine my life being without wine and being without the life I've had. But I imagine with horror my life with empty walls. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Stephen Spurrier, thank you for these.
Thank you so much.
These words today, and our entire interview with Stephen Spurrier will appear in winespeed.com's People to Know pages. Please read the whole thing. You'll be fascinated. And I'm Karen MacNeil. Thank you.
Karen, thank you so much. And thank you for this.